Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. We always pick a new film, either new in theaters, that doesn't exist anymore, but now new on streaming or new to streaming. What did we pick this week, Chris?
Well, we went back to 2008 for a little movie that I realized upon rewatching it for today's episode that I believe we were exactly the age of the protagonists when it came out.
Really? Oh, wow. I didn't realize that at all. Huh,
maybe you were 1 year older, because I know.
I might have been a little bit older, yeah.
A little younger than you, but it's the David Gordan Greene directed, Judd Apatow produced Pineapple Express, starring Seth Rogen and James Franco. Why did we pick this one, Dan? I feel like this was more you steering the ship this time. I did not fight it. I did not fight it.
You didn't fight it. I think for me, I have this weird obsession with this era of comedies that if you follow Twitter, someone put out an article basically saying that Step Brothers was the peak comedy of that era. And I've decided to go on a very long rant on Twitter about this. I'm very passionate about the aughts comedies because I think we were of that age where they sort of hit the hardest. And I think that, like, to me, that era, let's say old school through Step Brothers, 2003, 2008, and Pineapple Express, was a very kind of special moment in comedy. And so I kind of wanted to go back and see where I thought this fit into that sort of echelon or that canon of that improv comedy era. And, you know, I don't know. I had not seen it since it came out, I don't think. And I wanted to see if it had any sort of legs to it whatsoever. The basic plot of this movie, if you haven't seen it already, is Seth Rogen plays a process server who's a stoner and ends up getting embroiled in sort of I would say maybe like a light noir situation. James Franco is his drug dealer. They basically go on the run from a drug dealing kingpin who Seth Rogen had witnessed murder somebody. Not really spoilers because it happens in the first 10 minutes. But it's a very typical stoner comedy. It has a nice leisurely pace. And it was kind of in this moment when Seth Rogen was super hot. He had Superbad the year before. And of course, he wrote this with his good friend, Evan Goldberg. And then James Franco as well was in a super hot streak. They first had teamed up on Freaks and Geeks. And it was kind of this moment in the Apatow universe of comedy where you had kind of everybody coming together. And I think the wild card here is going to be the director, right? David Gordan Greene.
Absolutely.
You probably know more about him than I do. So what's your sort of take on him?
Well, yeah, I have to be honest. I was, getting deep into the art film school stuff in college, taking film studies classes. And I absolutely fell in love with his debut feature, George Washington, from 2000. It's not about the president. It's a piece of Americana, if you will. But it's an absolutely gorgeous film that is more in the vein of Terrence Malick than Judd Apatow. And so it's very confusing. It was to me when I heard the news that David Gordan Greene was going to do a stoner action comedy with Judd Apatow and Seth Rogen. And yet I have my issues with the Apatow verse. I am not a huge fan of the bigger movies of especially the ones directed by Apatow, like 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up. Like, I think they're fine. I enjoyed watching them, but I have no desire to watch them again. Yeah. But David Gordan Greene clearly was like on the path of being an auteur. He also put an amazing movie out in 2004 called Undertow, and that's what kind of sealed the deal for me. But he had also worked with Danny McBride on a film called All the Real Girls in 2003, starring Zooey Deschanel. And that film, while I don't think it's one of his better ones, it's definitely probably one of his most memorable. It was kind of like his throughway into the world of mainstream filmmaking, because obviously after that, Zooey Deschanel easily became a star. And then Danny McBride, clearly just like a hilarious dude in his own right. And then he basically brought David Gordan Greene to the set of Knocked Up And that's where, Judd and David met, and Seth, and it seemed to be like there was just some kind of, magic kind of bromance, which is obviously what the Apatow verse is all about. And they gave it a shot. I'm not really sure why, other than that they were just kind of like high off their own success. What do you think was it that just made them basically feels like they just wanted to do it because they wanted to do it? Like, the movie feels so haphazard, not only in its improvisational nature, but also the very one of the most interesting tidbits, I think, and I think is one of the saving graces of the movie, is that it was originally going to be Seth Rogen in the pot dealer role and James Franco in the process server role, and that just seems too easy. And because Franco wanted to try playing like a completely out of his mind drug dealer, they switched roles, and I think that's one of the like weird choices, along with choosing David Gordan Greene to direct this, that just makes it something special, if kind of an afterthought or kind of just like a friends hanging out.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. And how did this happen, right? So if you put it in sort of the time when it came out in 2008, that was sort of, I think, the end of that period that we were talking about. And so Apatow could basically do whatever he wanted. Seth Rogen could basically do whatever he wanted. You thinking back to that era, not just 40-Year-Old Virgin and Superbad and Knocked Up, Wedding Crashers, Shaun of the Dead, Anchorman, Old School. Rated R comedies essentially were in a pinnacle in that decade, right around this time period. And 2008 especially was a moment when it kind of all crested. In 2008, you had Tropic Thunder, you had Role Models, you had Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Zack and Miri Make a Porno, and of course, Pineapple Express. I think everything was getting greenlit. And it's kind of like how people joke about Netflix now. I think that everybody involved in this film, it was probably a bullshit idea they had when they were high. Let's be honest. And like that, in that environment where there was a lot of privilege and a lot of sort of just the ability to make money appear, an otherwise kind of off the wall and goofy idea comes to fruition. I think that's exactly what happened here. And you think about it too, so it's kind of, we set it in sort of the rated R sort of peak of comedies in the 2000s and the aughts, but it's also kind of, in the stoner comedy sort of history, it feels kind of different, right? It doesn't feel like, and I tried to go back and look at other stoner comedies, and I haven't seen how many, like Up in Smoke. Have you seen Up in Smoke, the original?
I don't think I've seen a Cheech and Chong movie all the way through. No. And then you got Half Baked, which classic,
wasn't really good, right?
No, but it was definitely like requisite viewing for any teenage boy in the 90s.
Of course, yeah. And then I think to a lesser extent, Harold and Kumar goes to White Castle. I don't know. Would you consider that is that like a big movie from the aughts or no? I don't even know contextually because I was not a huge pot smoker, so I just didn't know.
It wasn't on my radar. I mean, I would say Method Man and Redman's How High is the only other.
Yeah. From what was
the
2001?
Only other touchstone. And Dude, Where's My Car? I mean, that was.
Yeah, kind of a lights. Yeah, definitely a stoner comedy.
Yeah.
And I kind of, were we clamoring for a stoner comedy in 2008? I don't think so.
No.
I think it was just sort of, it just happened because people wanted to do it and they were kind of bored. And I think Apatow had the original idea, didn't he? To do some sort of action weed comedy. Right. And he knew that Rogen and Evan could write a good script, and it sort of, everything started to come together. But it is one of those, it does have that feeling when you watch it. It feels like an afterthought for two reasons. One, because it came at the end of a certain era of comedy, as it sort of changed over to more of a hangover style, which came out in 2009. And also the fact that it would have never normally gotten made outside of that environment, sort of a feeding frenzy for new ideas from that group of people. And sort of, what are some other sort of tidbits about how this thing sort of came into being?
Well, yeah. So Apatow seemed to kind of, I don't know if it was on the set of Knocked Up or, shortly thereafter, where him and Gordan Greene met, where essentially he wanted to, marry those two ideas. And I think another piece of stoner comedy that is missing in this equation that seems to be that needs to be talked about, because it's kind of the only other movie that I can think of that did marry those two ideas of like noir action with, stoner silliness, is The Big Lebowski, right?
Yeah,
and,
of course.
And of course, I think if anything, that's the only kind of reference point that makes sense to get somebody like an auteur such as David Gordan Greene involved, since it's a Coen Brothers movie. It's beloved by both, like nerds that, dissect everything minute by minute, as well as people that just want to like have a fun hangout movie for their friends. And so like it does seem like when they started putting the script together, specifically the story credit goes to Judd and the script credit goes to Rogen and Goldberg. And as we saw with Superbad, like these two have kind of like, it's almost like a magical like Affleck Damon in the 90s kind of chemistry, where it seems like it's very clear, like each one knows their role. Rogen's in charge of the gut busting laughs, and Goldberg's in charge of like the touching friendship piece. And it worked like gangbusters in Superbad. That's probably the only other Apatow produced comedy of that era that I would say is not just like laugh out loud hilarious, but actually like really sentimental in all the right ways. And I think that's another element to the script of Pineapple Express, or of the script that they used anyways, because obviously so much of it was improvised, that really made this come together. Because not only did Rogen and Goldberg have that in the script writing process, but then also Rogen and Franco, plus I would argue McBride, who was originally killed in the script, and they just had so much fun working with him on set that like you wouldn't have that trite but also just really heartwarming diner scene at the end where the three of them are best buds, and of course McBride's connection to Gordan Greene, and clearly they knew exactly how to work together as a team. It's just like that right confluence of like those three different pairs, and then Judd overseeing everything, and everybody's on the right page, and it ends up being something really, really special, even if
like it's more than its parts, right?
Exactly,
like
exactly.
It's that's interesting you bring up McBride, because I rewatching it, there's this scene where he's supposed to essentially get killed off, and it seems like he gets killed, and it almost seems like that was supposed to be what's happened in the entire sort of framing of the story, and then he just keeps coming back, which becomes its own little joke,
right?
Almost like his little like zombie McBride. But one thing that sort of stuck out to me, and there was always this conflict back then with these types of comedies, and specifically the improv style, where is it too improv-y? Is it too loose? And I think this rides that line really pretty well, actually. And the scene that I'll call out, and we have some production notes on it, and sort of that fight scene, right? The Franco, Rogen,
the initial one at McBride's house,
at McBride's house, where it kind of reminds me of that fight from They Live, where it's just like this extended sort of slapstick, sort of gonzo fight, but which clearly there's no way they really could have just scripted all that. A lot of that was made up on the set as they were doing it.
Right.
Do you think that looseness, how much does it add to this movie, and how much does it take away? Because it is definitely, and they quote, tons of it was improvised. Like they said over and over again in interviews, especially like Craig Robinson, the Hitman sort of stuff. Like I think in certain instances, especially relating to Craig Robinson, who clearly improvised a lot of his lines and his moments, works really well. But how well does it work as a broader narrative technique, do you think?
It's tough to say, man. I mean, those are watching it I think I probably watched it like 4 or 5 times on DVD, plus seeing it in the theaters. I was a huge fan of it when it came out. I mean, it was prime material for like 25-year-old, like still stuck in adolescence, trying to figure out how to grow up, which is exactly what the protagonist is. And so part of that, part of the attractive nature of that is to just kind of go along with just like the goofiness. And the thing is that like, some of the performers are clearly better at it than others. And so it took me out of it when Kevin Corrigan tried to do it. Like, I like the guy, like credit where credit's due. He's been around since Goodfellas. But like Craig Robinson steals every scene that they're in together. And same thing with Gary Cole and Rosie Perez. Like I like them a lot. I think they're both really funny and talented people, but they clearly have, improvisation is not their strong suit. So every time we see that, and then there's also the whole, speaking of like the improvised fighting, like I absolutely ate up every second of that initial fight in McBride's house, because McBride is so physical and the dialogue is so crazy. Like right before that fight happens, there's a great quote from David Gordan Greene in one of the interviews he did where like he talks about how, he always wanted to like do he likes doing movies that are one of a kind, right? Yeah. And that clearly goes back to his more serious work in the early 2000s. But then here, like the line that McBride says just out of nowhere, that you would see how surprised Rogen and Franco is that he says like, and then you ate a box of nerds out of her butt.
Like, that line is just like you're shocked even if you've seen everything. You're like,
I know.
What?
It's such a good line reading, and it's clearly let's just like come up with in the spur of the moment, and it works because he does so good at that. But then when you get into the huge battle at the underground compound at the end, I definitely got tired of it all by then.
Yeah, well, but the question is, why did you get tired of it? Like, why? And I think that's the general consensus of this film is that. We'll get to the reaction part of it in a bit, but it seems like the first 2/3 works pretty well.
Yes.
And the final third is it's messy.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really tie up a lot of the emotional narratives that are going on.
It's both too much and not enough. It just
exactly. And it's sort of you look at like a couple of the quotes that we're talking about here with David Gordan Greene. I never brought the script to set. I never even use it. If the scene is working, then it's working. I mean, to me, that is a mind-blowing statement to make as a director, right? Like, I just can't even fathom that you wouldn't be shooting from the script exactly word for word. And the improv would kind of be just let the tape run for extra, let the film run for an extra minute and just do it different ways. But he's not even using it for basic structure. It doesn't seem like. I find that kind of mind-blowing. But the thing is, it doesn't necessarily translate on screen, that looseness. I think in certain instances it does, like the fighting, but the actual emotional beats of the story are pretty strong. I would say up until the last third.
Yeah.
Even the stuff with the girlfriend and like even those scenes like being at the parents' house where, do you really need this? Probably not. But it kind of works to hit a certain point about where, Seth's character is at in life and where he wants to go and how he feels. There's actual depth there. Which you can't get by improvising. Like, it has to be written on a page as a narrative arc or emotional arc of a story. So I thought that like it walked that fine line and kind of fell off in the final third. And I think that's unfortunate because if they were able to stick that landing a little bit more, it could have kind of, I think, moved up a tier in that sort of aughts comedy sort of ranking for me personally, at least.
Agreed.
What do you think? What was the reaction to this movie when it came out?
I mean, I was blown away by it, and I think that there was like just a perfect synthesis of like I was still watching as I was.
Wait, we gotta go back. You were blown away by this movie.
I was just in stitches. The second I left that theater, I wanted to watch it again.
That is wow! I did not know this.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Immediately it like skyrocketed to the top of my like favorite movies of that decade, which is insane because there's no way it's in there now.
What do you think it was outside of like the coming of age story and the kind of zaniness of the script and the acting? What do you think it was that connected so well with you at that age?
And I was trying to revisit that as I rewatched it last night, and I really think that like you take away the last third. And like still like you have 100 minutes approximately, maybe 90 of just like scene by scene that they clearly just had the chemistry perfect. You brought up the dinner scene, Ed Begley Jr. and Nora Dunn as the parents. Just knock it out of the park. It's insane.
It's so good.
I mean, and then you've got the intro with Bill Hader doing like the first weed reference is like him doing a mouth jazz solo. Like
what do you think of your superiors? And he starts like scatting essentially.
Like Buddy Rich style. Like, I think that's it. It's like, it's a stoner comedy that is so out of left field but still like very much concerned with like giving you really big belly laughs. Not like Big Lebowski where like, I love the movie, but it's very much like it's giving you like head scratchers and like a couple like laugh out loud moments, but for the most part, it's a Coen Brothers movies. It's a strange character study, mixed in with philosophy and Nietzsche and stuff like that. But here it's just like it's just so free flowing, and even like the shaggy qualities are still like something to be admired, I think, from the perspective of like this is it's just like joy emanating from it. Like this is clearly like a bunch of people that had a fuckload of fun just filming this.
Yeah, and a lot of money too. I think Gordon Greene says something about it. It's basically right. I had 10 times more freedom on this movie than I did in any other movie because there's no financial burden. And so, I think that they not a blank check, but pretty darn close to what David Gordan Greene is used to.
Right.
And I think that like that lended itself to that openness and that looseness and that improvisational, the sort of the environment that would allow them to improv constantly and feel comfortable experimenting. And you could just see it and feel it on the screen pretty constantly. How did this actually do when it came out back in the day? Critics didn't love it, right? Some all critics score currently 68% on Rotten Tomatoes, 6.3 out of 10. That's not good. Top critics is even lower, 51%, 5.1 out of 10 actual score. That's terrible. The audience score, as it sits now, 73%, 7.5 out of 10. Significantly higher. Letterboxd, 3.3 out of 5. That's kind of a little bit surprising. I thought it would be like 3.5 or higher. They're very picky on there, those Letterboxd people. 6.9 out of 10 on IMDb. That's actually surprising. Like I thought it'd be like at least 7. And a cinema score of B+. So critics didn't like it at all when it came out. And I remember that. I remember there being a very muted response to it. I think people were kind of sick of the genre of the Apatow universe, rated R comedy stuff that was happening because there had been like, 5 films this year that were kind of in the similar vein. Cinema score of a B+ though is actually not that bad for something like this. Although there's one thing to note though, the cinema score. Everybody knows going into this movie knew what it was, right? It was a pop movie. It's a stoner movie. It was marketed that way 100%. Cinema Score scores people the Friday night it opens at 7:00 in like 12 different cities. So it's kind of a little bit bizarre to me. It gets a B+ from a crowd that was clearly all stoners that knew what the movie was going. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that, you can't get a more stocked pond of, what you're looking for in terms of a target audience. And it still gets a B+. So I think there was some, you know what I think that is? That's the Gordan Greene style.
Yeah.
Like it's the way that he shoots things. It's the obtuseness. It's the strangeness sometimes of what he's doing. It doesn't always connect with a wider audience. What about the box office? What did it do box office wise?
Well, yeah, it had a 23 million opening weekend, which I don't know. That's
not bad. That's not bad.
No, but I mean, it's for a rated R comedy that had ended up having a box office run of 87 million, box office worldwide 102, legs of 3.76. That's good, especially for something that did, like I mentioned, like kind of seem like an afterthought, just people getting together and having fun. But I don't know. What do you think in like the terms of like long term? Like a lot of these stoner comedies, like Half Baked, bombed at the movie theater, but then went on to become like a cult classic. So it's also hard to kind of gauge something like this where like, yeah, it did well at the box office, but does it have the same kind of, not like financial legs, but like cultural legs? Like, are people still, I was trying to like find any like discourse about it today, and it doesn't seem like there's as much love for it as perhaps there was when it came out, or even like into the early 2010s when Seth Rogen was still, did everything kind of die down for Seth Rogen? I know he's got American Pickle coming out in a couple weeks, but
yeah, that's an interesting question because I came across, I think, a Reddit thread about this movie recently, and they were kind of going back and forth about it, and this movie's so funny and stuff like that. I kind of think it's going to be, and I think Cheech and Chong is a little bit like this too. Like Cheech and Chong is sort of like this cultural touch point, but like it's not like a popular movie that people just like, oh, I love that movie.
Right.
You watch it to smoke pot to. That's its purpose. And I think Pineapple Express might be sort of caught in that cycle where they're not going to view it as a movie on its own terms.
Mm-hmm.
They're just going to view what it represents. I don't think Zoomers and people younger than us are really going to be that into it, because pot's so... The one thing that's going to be missing for context with younger people, let's say under 30, is that even 2008, pot was not legal in most places.
Right.
And it's maybe not even most legal now, but weed is just a part of our culture now that it wasn't in 2008. And before, it was more of this sort of rebellion thing that you were doing. And it was this rebellion sort of sign of, I'm a maverick. I'm doing my own thing. I don't care what my parents say. I don't care what the government says. And that's a huge part of this film. I think that's going to be lost on a lot of younger people, because they're going to be like, what's the big deal? It's just smoking weed. Like I do that every day. Like, you know what I mean? Like that level of like being an iconoclast, it's not there anymore. Right. And so I think that sort of edge to it and the stoner lifestyle, I think it's changed a lot. And I think it's a lot more mainstream than it was back then. And this is, if you were a stoner, let's say in the mid 2000s, you were kind of dropping out a bit from society. And that's no longer the case. Like people who are executives smoke pot all the time. So like, I think that dichotomy is gone. I think it'll lose a lot from that. What do you think? Do you think it's going to still hold up?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about my experience as a high school teacher, and it's definitely like not been a thing that's talked about in terms of like rebelliousness. It's definitely like, I'm at the point where like my students' parents smoke pot, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it's interesting. It did like spark a couple bells while I was rewatching in that opening montage where he's interacting with the talk radio hosts while driving from location to location, serving people papers. And he says something to the effect of Seth Rogen's character. Dale Denton says, if marijuana isn't legal in 5 years, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like thinking to myself, like, it's 2020 now. That's like 12 years later. And there's still only 11 states that have, flat out legality for marijuana for recreational use. And so on the one hand, it's like, yeah, we still have like a long ways to go to continue to like normalize and mainstream this. And yet like just that, 1/5 of the country legalizing it, and then it's, medically available, I believe, in all states now, where it's,
I think for the most part, yeah.
Yeah.
Missouri, it's legal.
But, and also just like, at least pre-pandemic anyways, like if people wanted pot, they'd only have to go to a few states over to get it. And so I think there is like that element to it. And you make a good point, because like James Franco's character is like this, shut in that always wears pajamas, and like maybe that just might not make sense to people nowadays.
Yeah, I don't know viewers. If it would. I don't know if it would really connect with them as sort of that outsider viewpoint. And I think that like, I don't know, like when looking back on like Half Baked and stuff like that, I wonder what people are going to think about that movie. I think that that's going to have more of a cult feel to it for some reason, because that was kind of its own little island. And you're like, you see that movie, you're like, how did this get made?
Right.
Whereas this one, you're sort of like, well, yeah, it makes sense how it got made. Who's involved? It sort of had this cultural cachet in that moment, and it kind of, I think Pineapple Express to me lives more as a part of that era of comedy in the Apatow universe than it does the stoner movie universe, if that makes sense. And it feels like much more indebted to the knocked up Superbad era. I mean, it kind of looks like Superbad. I feel like they shot this movie in the same sort of like the valley of Los Angeles. It has that really specific feel of like Van Nuys or Encino or something like that. So it feels definitely a part of that universe. And so I don't know if younger people are going to connect with it on the stoner part, but I think the comedy part of it is what's going to live on. And I feel like that improv and that chemistry between Rogen, Franco, and McBride and Robinson and everybody in the cast, I think that's the spark and the magic here. And I think that's what I think people are going to connect with in 10 years or 20 years. What did critics think, though, when this thing came out?
Yeah, so let's get into that. Like you mentioned, it was definitely muted, but there were a couple key critics that kind of caught on to what made it special. Most notably, probably A.O. Scott, then the head writer for the AV Club, but now is New York Times big shot guy. But he made a point that good stoner comedies like Pineapple Express have a rambling shaggy dog nature that can make quirky little detours and non sequiturs more essential than story itself. Like that just goes back to the David Gordan Greene thing, where it's just like, that seems like such a wild idea to get an indie auteur in here, but he's able to make those detours feel a lot more naturalistic, and it's almost like on a subconscious level, and that's what makes it fun and unique, because then you get into that and you don't really have to worry too much about, you know, going from, you know, plot A to plot B. And then Claudia Pugh of USA Today also gave it a good score, saying Rogen and Franco have great comic chemistry. The initial scenes in Franco's apartment absurdly funny and establish their whacked out friendship. And I think that's important to note, is like, unlike Superbad, where it's clearly like two best friends that have, you know, been friends since they were little kids, like these are two guys that, you know, essentially out of loneliness connect with each other, and they've only known each other for a couple months, only as, you know, client and drug dealer, and that gives the feeling more of like, you know, a Journey style as they run away from the corrupt cop and the kingpin. They have that connection deepen. And then Roger Ebert was actually one of the few kind of big time critics to note the more attractive qualities of Pineapple Express, and he goes so far as to, you know, take the bromance stereotype of the time to an even deeper level. And he has this amazing quote in his review. He says, does this make Dale and Saul gay, even if they're not aware of it? I think that describes the buddies in a lot of movies produced by Judd Apatow, including the recent Step Brothers. And like the homoeroticism, he's just, I love that, you know, Ebert's always known, you know, for the bald-faced kind of just like blunt truth-telling, where it's just like everybody's talking about it in these very obtuse kind of new slang ways. But ultimately, yeah, that's what it comes down to, is the reason this works is, you know, it's sensitive, it's sentimental, and it's straight up like just doesn't care. I will say that the one aspect of that just like didn't hit right on a rewatch 12 years later is in the third act, which we've said before has its problems, but when they're trying to get out of the handcuffs, that's just like, I mean, that's like the gay panic of the whatever that Kevin James Adam Sandler movie was.
Yeah, it just did not. And then like, you know, I think that's an interesting point. They bring this up over and over, like their sort of relationship and the male closeness here, and like they joke about it in the movie fairly often. But I also find that as a sort of a weird take on it, because it's so clearly about two men who are emotionally maladapted. Like, let's be honest, most men are, because of the way our society raises men. Mm-hmm. And I find it fascinating that like anytime like two men are trying to be close with one another and there's emotions involved, there's always a sort of the homosexual sort of angle. It's sort of like, you're kind of like almost like and it was pretty incessant with this movie when it came out, I remember. And, you know, I always wonder about that, because you even look back to like Superbad, which is just kind of a beautiful film about male friendship. But did it ever come up when people were talking about that film? Versus this one? I don't know. It's sort of like it's a lens through which we looked at a lot of stuff back then and think to a lesser extent now. That sort of, when you see it, I think when someone younger sees this movie, that's not even going to be really a question they ask themselves, right? It's going to be just like, hey, these are two guys that kind of, you know, grow to love each other, and they love each other as friends or whatever, and there's nothing really to question, or there's nothing really to define, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And I think there's always people looking to define things in a movie like this. It kind of reminds me a lot of being in grad school, and we would read like a short story, and like, you know, if you're a Marxist theorist, all you see is capital and the bourgeoisie and all that kind of stuff. If you're, you know, certain other theorists, you see it's all sexualized and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I thought it was kind of a sweet movie, and I kind of like felt that was pretty explicit, that like these guys are all just chill friends and love each other, and I think that's cool.
Right. But that was weird for the 2000s. Like, it was a shift, and of course 100%. During that shift, you're going to have this overlap between, you know, gay panic and homophobia versus like genuine like love between two guys. On the negative front, Stephanie Zacharek, at the time of Salon, now the lead writer at Time for film, said Apatow may have good instincts, but that doesn't mean he has to follow every single one. And the tedious stoner action comedy Pineapple Express is a case in point. So a flip side to the more forgiving view of the detours and non sequiturs that A.O. Scott pointed out. And David Edelstein of Vulture said it's empty and formulaic with plotting that's lazy even by stoner comedy standards. I don't think David Edelstein really understands what stoner comedies are. And then Michael Srago of the Baltimore Sun said the plot is merely an excuse for the audience to get a giddy hit off some heady secondhand smoke while laughing and cheering at cartoon sadism that attempts and fails to put the slap back in slapstick. It's just bummer town. Like, just,
yeah, those negative reviews are not really smart.
No,
like, they're not really hitting it. Like, I think you could really pick apart this film on a couple of levels. The lazy third act where the improv style falls apart. Maybe the sort of blunted emotional journey that he goes on. What's really resolved for the protagonist at the end of this. But like they just kind of go through the sort of, it's more attacking who made it than attacking what's on screen, I think, is what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. And the other sort of tidbit that I just want to mention before I close up the show is that, we talked a lot about the Apatow universe and like kind of what he created with this group of people. But in a recent, I don't know if you've been listening to the Office, Oral History of the Office podcast, but there's a moment in it where they talk about, well, how did you find all these people? And it ended up being this casting director, Allison Jones. And I sort of dove deeper into her career. She's the one who cast all of those people in Freaks and Geeks. Mm-hmm. She found Jonah Hill. She found Seth Rogen. She's found James Franco. She's kind of the person that I think, we talk about Judd Apatow and all those people, Will Ferrell, but I think there's this kind of unspoken or unheralded sort of builders and pioneers like Allison Jones, this casting director that really brought these people out of obscurity into the forefront that allowed this sort of era to take off. And so I just wanted to throw that out. There's a really good New Yorker article about what she does and how she does it. In any event, so how do you want to close out Pineapple Express? What are your closing thoughts on this film?
Well, it was really fun to look back on and talk about more on like a visceral level compared to the other movies that we've watched, where it's been a lot more heady, or even just like depressing, like the Kevin Bacon horror movie, The Darkness.
The Darkness.
I mean, I think that's part of the takeaway is that it's a good reminder to just like inject some just joy. Not everything has to be. It's still like every frame of this movie is beautiful because David Gordan Greene is behind it, but still like you got to let yourself have fun.
Yeah. It's a great hearty laugh, and it's almost like a period piece when you think of it.
Yeah.
Of like the mid-aughts and late-aughts. It kind of really take you to that time period in Los Angeles and what people were up to. So next week we're gonna do a new film. We're gonna do The Rental. Directed by Dave Franco, James's brother. Keep it in the Franco family. It is his first ever movie that he's directed. He co-wrote it with the mumblecore icon Joe Swanberg, who I love recently. Do you like him?
Is that
Joe
the
Swanberg?
Drinking Buddies guy?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I like
a
him.
movie that I hated and then became one of my top 5 movies of all time. So he co-wrote the script with Franco. It sounds kind of like a really fun disaster. So I'm excited about diving into it and see what they came up with. And so that's what we're going to do next week. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been Film Trace.